Welcome to episode 5, concluding our program examining economic resilience in Alberta this past fall and since 2015. I'm Perry Kincaid, and I'm hosting this episode, trying hard not to lecture or editorialize, but failing to keep it short. First, any discussion of options for resolving Alberta's regional and sectoral weak economic resilience has been complicated by COVID, its socioeconomic impact, and measures to contain it. These are indeed confusing times, you might even say troubling. The data and your sentiment show as much. In the foreground, there's COVID, message to mask, to isolate or not, business closures, and encouragement to spend locally. All this against a background of an already troubled economy, declining corporate investment, job losses, and billions gone in GDP. What to do? In assembling this episode, I've taken into consideration your views with a focus on the economy, the background as contained in the October survey, prior surveys, and complementary resolutions contained in the proceedings of a provincial convention in Red Deer in 2016. The convention concluded with a series of conference consultations that had been held earlier in 2015, first in Edmonton and then in Calgary. The convention featured presentations of big ideas and the very industries, public and professional service sectors that we've been assessing in this consultation. Let me know if you'd like a copy of the proceedings. There are 3 bold thrusts recommended for strengthening Alberta's economic resilience that have been identified in the survey and in the convention in 2016. This slide once again summarizes our current situation and the situation since 2015 with the more recent rise in an assessment of the effectiveness of the innovation ecosystem and decline in the assessment of Alberta's overall economic resilience, and with the crude oil prices showing the relationship of shifts in your sentiment tied closely to the price of oil, or crude oil in particular. The 3 bold thrusts that have been identified include energy transition, and that is expediting transitions in energy to reduce Alberta's exposure to the industry's volatility and generate economic alternatives. Changing the mix of economies for improving regional and sectoral economic resilience with special attention to public services. And thirdly, leadership and innovation. That is developing Alberta's innovation ecosystem, supporting Alberta's entrepreneurs, key to innovation. In addition, we conclude with a brief discussion of the role of government, resistance to change, and post-COVID economic recovery. But first, the first thrust, energy transition. Alberta overall, and specifically the Calgary region and the industry sector, is what will be the focus of this particular summary, and that is energy transitions. Calgary is Alberta's oil industry capital, vulnerable to geopolitical events, forcing a transition in energy that has affected all other Alberta industries, professional and public services. Edmonton is Alberta's public service capital, with also vulnerable, but buffered in the short term, as in 2015-16, by increased government hiring and spending. The interdependency of the Calgary and Edmonton economies with government as the intermediary is real, but changing. The Calgary and other regions and industry have no choice but to respond to the geopolitical forces driving the transitions underway, overhauling the energy industry and energy in general worldwide. Daily, we hear in Calgary of collaborative initiatives. We hear of new technologies being introduced to reduce carbon emissions, making crude oil more acceptable to existing and new markets. We hear of the resolution of regulatory impediments and long-term agreements, and I do say they've taken a long term to be achieved, bridging energy and environmental interests. Researching and fine-tuning the application of economic incentives and disincentives for expediting change. Securing partners and investors for processing Alberta carbon in agriculture and forestry, mining and energy, including hydrogen, and anticipating renewed interest in nuclear, fission, and fusion. Industry and community leaders active in pooling capital and attracting investors, advocating for innovation and mobilizing entrepreneurs. And finally, responding to market interests in climate change through electrification and the adoption of alternative forms of energy. From this point on, I'm going to ignore further discussion of Calgary and those directly impacted by the oil industry. The industry does remain volatile, but the critical energy transition is apparently underway that should benefit economic resilience throughout Alberta, its regions and sectors. It is the services situation that next warrants special consideration. And this is deemed a service transition involving Alberta overall, and specifically the Edmonton Region and public services. Public services were identified in the survey as the weakest sector in Alberta compared with professional services and industry, particularly in the Edmonton Region. The region's economy is the least diverse and the most heavily dependent on the Alberta government as the sole regulator and funder of most public services. The region and the sector are also the most resistant to change. Why? First, the Edmonton Region is the locus of Alberta government lobbyists and provincial NGOs that have an interest in sustaining the status quo, usually. Public service staffing is comprised of well-educated, vocal, and unionized professionals. Any proposed change in public services impacts and is therefore involving all the regions. The public and the media view public services as a right, justified as a monopoly, and to be protected regardless of costs. If the Edmonton Region and the public sector's weak economic resilience are to be strengthened, change will require a vision with sustained and committed, persuasive and influential leadership at both the regional and provincial levels. Both are needed. The gap identified in a supplementary report on impediments to the Edmonton Region's economic development identified vision as leadership as number one. It also identified the weather, by the way. To resolve the overweighting of public services in the region warrants several additional considerations. For example, we could consider regionalization of resources, decentralizing the concentration of public service staff and services, though this has been tried. Initiating a public discussion about the future of public services across the board and whether it is time to shift the focus at the top from building capacity to serving people. Introducing personalization of services for guiding the transition. The appeal would be particularly relevant for education and health, given existing technologies in telecommunications that are being tried, true, and tested as a byproduct of the COVID impact. Research, recruitment, and curriculum would reflect the reorientation of public services. And introducing options for advancing the adoption of innovation, including increased involvement of private and community services, and introducing measures for helping educate the users, increase competition by allowing consumer choice, and monitoring user satisfaction. And finally, incentivizing unions and professional associations to engage in transition training for their members. In fact, this should be mandatory in light of the rate of change driven by emerging technologies. Community-based NGOs warrant special attention and a special comment. Here, they are an important and often overlooked, undervalued socioeconomic asset. There are over 23,000 NGOs in Alberta, and maybe more. They too are a public service, but they are not very resilient, dependent on the Alberta Liquor and Government Control Board, government grants, experiencing declining memberships, aging boards, and increasing competition for volunteers and funding, along with not so subtle issues of accountability. Here's a recommendation for social enterprise should be encouraged, with NGOs incentivized to collaborate, to consider mergers, and for being held accountable. And finally, identifying leadership and associated resources for championing and guiding the transition of public services to more personalized service and service delivery. The leaders should be in the public eye, hosting events such as conventions for exposing big ideas and innovations of broad interest to sectors with weak economic resilience. And staying with economic resilience, but now looking at resolving the diverse regional and sectoral differences that is moving on from public services and the issues that were quite specific to Edmonton. We all need to look ahead. Several megatrends are anticipated as the sources and forces of significant change. To survive, to grow, all industries and businesses, all professions and practices, including those in public service, must be alert, innovative, and nimble. Let's consider energy again, for example, but appreciate technology is changing everything in transportation and logistics, environment and clean tech, agriculture and agri-foods, education and e-learning, infotech and analytics, engineering and design, construction and materials, financing and fintech, manufacturing and robotics, health and biotech, to mention just a few. The list is never ending. These changes are of particular concern to Alberta youth, who in our earlier research identified emerging technologies and the future of work as one of their greatest concerns, and whether they are being prepared for Alberta's future. Change should be anticipated. No economy is forever. Let's consider energy again, as I mentioned a moment ago, as it is core to Alberta's economy, and even when transitioned, is likely to remain for some time to come as a key driver of the Alberta economy. Carbon is the foundation of life, its extraction, harvesting, and transport in oil and gas, in agriculture, and in forestry, but not so much in processing here in Alberta. As we discussed earlier, however, this sector is in transition. Carbon as the foundation of life remains, but changes are underway. Silicon is carbon's competitor, competing and contributing to the diversification of economies everywhere. Chips storing and processing data, digitization, the Internet of Everything, apps for aiding decision-making across all industries and professions, and affecting our everyday lives as we carry cell phones universally around the world with instant access to data, fast, and generally affordable. This phenomena alone is changing everything. The relationship between professionals and the haves and clients, the have-nots. It's the basis of what is called the digital divide for those included and excluded from the digital economy. But no one should be left behind. This trend must be attended to. As a positive, it is the basis of personalization, but it also has surfaced issues of privatization, and it is possibly a new alternative for taxation that is currently being investigated on both sides of our border. Are the regions prepared? That is, are they resilient? Apparently not, though southern and central Alberta are on the right track. The mix of economies differ between regions. They each warrant their own unique adjustments, though all are affected by oil and export markets, forestry and mining, and somewhat agriculture. Tourism in the Rockies and transportation are likewise heavily reliant on external markets. But Alberta has not, at least yet, embraced silicon. Note, artificial intelligence has now replaced nanotech as the next big thing in the Edmonton region. Stay tuned. This could be good news, along with the recent announcements regarding the move to hydrogen. The space of change and the scale of change triggered by emerging technologies warrants a regional approach to economic development as opposed to business attraction that is local in the interest of local municipalities. Business interests and economic interests are often confused. Again, a regional approach to economic development is critical for accommodating the role that emerging technologies are and will be playing in our economy. Where warranted, strengthening economic resilience on a regional and/or an industrial scale may warrant partnerships with governments to aid in negotiations for securing long-term certainty, that is, trading and regulatory agreements, so very important for attracting capital. Let me shift now to the innovation ecosystem as our third initiative, affecting Alberta as a whole, its regions, and all sectors. This takes us to the very exciting theme, that of Alberta's innovation ecosystem and its development, that you have acknowledged as core to innovation and fundamental to the early survival, growth, and retention of entrepreneurs and small and medium businesses in Alberta. By the way, it's imperative that more effort be devoted to explaining just what is meant by an innovation ecosystem. For the purpose of this consultation, we've meant the array of resources and processes dedicated to the survival, growth, and retention of small and medium enterprises and entrepreneurs. While you've indicated that the system remains weak, it is increasing in effectiveness, with the weaker elements being in vision and leadership and management processes. That is not to say that resources and infrastructure are acceptable, but it is the human contributions to the system's development that need to be prioritized. Emerging technologies are pervasive, touching all of us, and continue to evolve at an ever-increasing rate. And so the recommendations directed at developing Alberta's innovation ecosystem are as follows. Other than the innovation ecosystem, new emerging technologies are by definition new and poorly resourced. They have no network for supporting their survival, growth, and retention. This is the mandate of Alberta Innovates to develop. Alberta Innovates should be given a strong mandate to work directly with Alberta institutions of advanced education and the network of public and private accelerators for advancing innovation and expediting the commercialization of emerging technologies from research institutes, colleges, and universities. These accelerators should be held accountable for the development of their tenants, and tenants must be held accountable to graduate and exit when pre-agreed upon time-limited objectives are achieved. Relational skills must be strengthened in SMEs and the professions, as this gap is central to their failure to survive, growth, and to stay. This means revising curriculum and coaching. SMEs should be incentivized and prepared to consider mergers as a growth strategy. In regions where infotech is weakest, for example, there are extraordinary opportunities to scale up, again through mergers. Note, infotech continues to be the source of extraordinary innovation, but Alberta-based leadership is lacking, overwhelmed by multinational interests. Incentives should be introduced to encourage the pooling of capital and the investment by Albertans in Alberta companies. Prime should be companies in prioritized sectors. Public procurement policies and practices must be overhauled, including an alignment with objectives to strengthen economic resilience, including specifically credit for early stage innovation and partnering. Now, in conclusion, let me cite a couple of special issues. There are three that will have a bearing on executing change: the role of government, resistance to change, and COVID-19 impeding economic recovery. Each of these are worthy of a report, but suffice it to say that the survey was particularly clear on the most appropriate roles for government. The survey may have overlooked one not mentioned in this list, but one that has become clear in the commentary, and that is sustained leadership with a vision. You cited or selected the formulating of policies and employing incentives for encouraging small business innovation as the highest priority of the list, with promoting entrepreneurship and small business startups as second. I think you get the thrust. Alberta needs to effect significant changes in its economy, having lost billions, thousands of jobs, and now increased government deficits due to COVID. Geopolitical events are driving industry to change, but for others, there will be resistance to change, particularly from the public sector. That sector and the associated professional services need government's assistance to help and lead the transition of their sectors. It is the regulator and the funder. It is the role of government to oversee the transition and reassure the public with clarity on the objectives, to improve service quality by personalizing services and ensure service continuity, while at the same time strengthening the sectors overall. As for COVID and managing the pandemic, who knows? A quick recovery is compromised by weak economic resilience. The Alberta government released its plan for economic recovery in June. The following are supplementary recommendations. 1, job creation. Spending to increase public sector jobs is clearly not warranted unless affordable, that is, conditional on debt tolerance and/or available resources. Both today are spent. This option is further constrained by the high labor costs carried over from the last boom. Expectations should, however, decline as the downturn continues. But as noted, the public sector needs leadership, and to be reminded it is not acceptable to spend today if it means sacrificing the future. Secondly, addressing taxation. Increasing government revenue through taxation may be considered, such as introducing a PST, a provincial sales tax, as have other jurisdictions, but it does not exist today in Alberta. But such a tax is both unpopular in Alberta and proven to hurt even further the most vulnerable and small business activity. Regardless, should a tax be introduced, it would be hopefully dedicated to debt reduction and then be eliminated. Well, that would be a first. And then there's austerity. Reducing operating expenditures is justified as Alberta has the highest per capita service expenditures in Canada. These costs should be brought down in line with the rest of the country without sacrificing service standards. This is particularly important to stem out migration. Surely COVID will play itself out through the damage, though the damage may take years to heal. Unfathomable debt and the federal government's pending introduction of a wealth transfer tax that will gut another generation of entrepreneurs, a subject we've discussed before. And an array of deep social and economic wounds, but a public awakening that brings new opportunities. Changes as identified in this consultation may be easier to execute following the COVID debacle. I'd like to thank you very much. Should you want a copy of my speaking notes, please let me know. And in conclusion, I thank you, but I also want to thank the suppliers that have made this program series possible. I'd like to thank Tom Dodd with Vision Media. I'd like to thank Michelle Lassard with Websites in Edmonton. I'd like to thank Kevin McNulty with the Canada Institute for International Trade. And in particular, for survey support, I'd like to thank the Economic Developers Alberta, the Alberta Council of Technologies, and AB Cole Econ. For each of you, thank you very, very much, and good night.